Hello, I'm Stephen Best, the director of Berkeley's Townsend Center for the Humanities. Welcome to the third discussion in our Berkeley Book Chats fall series. For this semester, we'll be hosting the book chats remotely while construction on Stevens Hall continues. Our hope is to return to hosting these events in person starting next spring. But for the time being, please continue to join us online. Before we begin today's conversation, I'd like to mention a few things about our upcoming schedule. First, we will not be broadcasting a book chat next week. We will reconvene in 2 weeks on Wednesday, October 12th, when we'll be joined by James Porter, a professor in the departments of Rhetoric and Ancient Greek and Roman Studies. James will be speaking with two of our colleagues, Mario Telo and Mark Griffith, about his recent book, Homer, the Very Idea. Also in October, we'll be hosting the first in our In Dialogue with China Art, Culture, Politics series, organized by Michael Nyland and Hans Sluga. So join us on Monday, October 17th for Cultural Heritage in China as Endangered Species, ? A conversation with Wei Zhao and Thomas Hahn. Those events will be in person in the Social Science Matrix. Today, we're delighted to hear Kate Heslop, professor of Scandinavian, discuss her recent book, Viking Mediologies, A New History of Skaldic Poetics. Kate is joined by Jonas Wellendorf, chair of the Scandinavian department, and himself an expert in Skaldic poetry. Kate, Jonas, thank you for joining us. Take it from here, Jonas.
Thank you very much, and welcome all to this book chat hosted by the Townsend Center for the Humanities at UC Berkeley. As you just heard, my name is Jonas Wellendorf, and I have the great pleasure and the privilege to be moderating this conversation with my colleague, Kate Heslop. Kate is an assistant professor in the Department of Scandinavian at UC Berkeley, and she's a specialist in Old Norse studies, and in particular in Skaldic poetry, about which we will be hearing more in a moment, I believe. She received her PhD from the University of Sydney in Australia, and before joining the Berkeley faculty in 2015, she had spent 8 years at the University of Zurich, where she held a postdoctoral fellowship and was later hired as a lecturer. She has published widely within the field of Old Norse studies, with an emphasis on Skaldic poetry and memory studies, and she has also produced scholarly editions with commentary and translation of some seminal Old Norse Skaldic poems. The reason she is with us today is that her book, a monograph entitled Viking Mediologies, A New History of Skaldic Poetics, was published earlier this year with Fordham University Press. The book has been greeted with a lot of excitement by the scholarly community, and it has generated, I would say, genuine enthusiasm from colleagues around the world. The first review is also out, and it amounted to a standing ovation in which the reviewer praised the book as profoundly erudite and beautifully written. And the reviewer concluded with the sentences, "This is a wonderful book, read it." So before we turn to the discussion of the book and its place in scholarship in more detail, I hope it will not be improper to just throw a softball question at Kate. So Kate, the book is out. How does it feel?
It feels great, Jonas. I should add that even though it did happen during the pandemic and so was somewhat invisible, I am now an associate professor. I was tenured in 2020 on the strength of the monograph, so I'm not an assistant any longer.
Did I say that?
You did.
Oh, sorry.
But yeah. No, it's easy to miss, right? We were all hiding at home in 2020. But yes, it feels very good. I'm very satisfied that this work of long years is out and I think looking quite handsome.
Yes, I agree, definitely. It may be useful to begin by just breaking down the title of the book. You have chosen to call it Viking Mediologies, And mediology is a relatively new concept that perhaps not everyone are familiar with. But then we have Viking as well, which is sort of a term that's deceptively familiar. And most of us have some idea about the when, the where, and the who, and so on of the Vikings. But taken together, Viking Mediologies in the plural, what does that mean?
Of course, its anachronism is intentional. It's meant to present a kind of clash of these two concepts that one probably does not usually encounter in the same sentence. The idea of a mediology is one that I've adopted from the French media studies of the 1970s, where it's used to describe a kind of self-theorization taking place in media. And a more familiar instantiation of this might be W.J.T. Mitchell's idea of medium theory. So the idea that products in the medium theorize about the medium in which they manifest. And so what I want to stress by conjoining these two terms, Viking and Mediologies, is that there is a theorization of the medium of skaldic poetry going on in the Viking poetry that is our earliest source for skaldic studies, that it's not a matter of an era of production followed by a poetological era of reflection, but that we have processes of active theorization going on already in the Viking Age. And I think as well, putting the word Viking in the title kind of nails my colours to the mast. I do believe that this poetry really did exist in the Viking Age, and that the texts that we have bear some relation to that Viking Age tradition.
Thank you. And I guess we will be looking at some examples in just a moment. But in addition to the title, there's also a subtitle to the book, which is A New History of Skaldic Poetics. And A History of Skaldic Poetry and Poetics came out in 2005, sort of still considered a relatively new book, I would say. But yours is clearly newer. But it's also a very different kind of work. And the term history implies, I think, a diachronic perspective, a trajectory of sorts that is being laid out. So what kind of trajectory is it that you trace in the book?
Yeah, I think this is a great question. I gather that calling things a new history can be regarded as rather obnoxious, as even pretentious and presumptuous. And I agree that the most recent work with this title is quite a recent one, and is in fact by the person who supervised my doctoral work, Margaret Clunies-Ross. So this is a kind of act of assassination, really, though I hope Margaret doesn't interpret it in that way. I think the idea of a new history is meant to suggest that rather than tracing a developmental trajectory where we have perhaps a model of a primitive origins, a classical flourishing, and a later decadent decline into poetry of less interest and purely kind of analytical commentary, that my history is not chronologically arranged, but rather arranged as a series of topics. And it's rather than being wedded to a developmental narrative, it traces some long-term continuities, which you could perhaps see rather as a matter of memory, a topic that interests me. For instance, in the Kviðuháttr memorial tradition, where there are interesting continuities from the earliest poem in this genre that we have, probably from the 10th or perhaps even the 9th century, if we credit the Rök stanza as an instance of that, right up until the 13th century, when we have our latest instance. And that these poems are engaged in a kind of intertextual memory. So the very sound of the meter, I think, resounds in the ears of later poets, and they take up the norms established by the Viking Age poetry and turn its conventions in new directions. But I wouldn't necessarily want to see that as the process that is characteristic for the entire corpus. I think there are other cases where we have much more discontinuity. I explore some of those in the discussion of ekphrasis, where I think there isn't much reference back by the Christian ekphrastic poetry of the 12th and 13th centuries to the Viking Age ekphrases. And I think too that while the media caesura, so to speak, between that is imposed by the introduction of the codex into Scandinavia, is a kind of significant phenomenon in the media landscape of skaldic verse. It's also one that we shouldn't think too rigidly as a before and after. And I think somewhat symptomatic of this is the fact that the first image of a manuscript in the book is of a manuscript approximately contemporary with the Viking Age poetry. It's not, of course, a Scandinavian manuscript because the Scandinavians didn't write at this point, but book culture was around. It may have been known to the skalds in some mediated fashion in this early period.
Okay, yeah, thanks. That's a very good point. The cover of the book is graced by this beautiful photo of a stone standing in what looks like to be a blooming strawberry field. I'm not sure, but it looks like a strawberry field. So it may be worthwhile to spend just a few minutes on this stone. What kind of stone is this, and what do we see on it?
Yes, indeed. Thank you. This is a great question. It was, as I think it often is, quite a mission finding an image for the cover. I was helpfully counseled by the people at Fordham, my press, who said, you don't want a composite, you want a single striking image. Even if you feel as if all of the topics of the book can't be encompassed in a single image, you have to try. And so my solution was to take this runestone. This is the Karlevi runestone, dating from about the year 1000, on the island of Öland in the Baltic, off the coast of southern Sweden. And this stone is famous in skaldic studies because it contains the earliest attestation of a stanza in the central skaldic meter of Drottkveit. And if I may, I will show you a slide.
Oh, yes. Yeah, please do. Yeah.
With this stanza on it. So I hope that this is visible to you. So the runestone has a short prose introduction, and then it has this stanza that you see on the left-hand side of the slide there. And this is, although it is quite early, a fully formed instance of the Drottkveit meter. You can perhaps see that I've marked the crucial sonorous features of this meter in color. So the red letters are alliteration, which binds the lines together into couplets. Well, the blue letters are what's known as skothending, consonantal rhyme, which is characteristic of the odd-numbered lines, so the first lines in each of those couplets. And the green letters are full rhyme, which is characteristic of the second half of the couplets. As you can see, the stanza falls into two syntactical halves. It's marked in the addition text here by a full stop at the end of the fourth line. And the translation on the right, I'll just read briefly, perhaps, if I may. The tree of the Thrúður of battles, which is to say the Thrúður of battles is the Valkyrie, and the tree of that being is the warrior, whom followed the greatest deeds, lies buried in this mound. Most people knew that. Then in the second half stanza, a battle-strong, more undamaging Viður of the chariot of the huge ground of Endil. So the huge ground of Endil being the sea, the chariot of that being a ship, and Viður, an Odin name, being the person who guides the ship, the seafarer. So a better one of these seafarers will not rule over land in Denmark. So this is a stanza of poetic praise of a fallen warrior. And this is what appears on the backside, or well, in relation to the cover of my book, the backside, what is normally thought of as the front side of the Karlevi stone. So you can see on the left-hand side there, just a little tiny piece of the runic inscription, and then the large expanse of very pretty granite, blank originally, we think, and then some Latin letters that make up perhaps some words whose interpretation is quite uncertain. And so the reason that I'm showing the backside of Karlevi on the front of my book is to stress this point of materiality, that books about medieval texts tend to have chunks of manuscripts on their covers that no one really intends that you actually read, but which evoke the medium of the book. And on the front of my book, I needed something that evoked the broader media landscape, and of course landscape in quite a literal sense with its strawberry fields too.
Thank you. It's a fascinating stanza. So it mentioned that it said no warrior will ever rule in Denmark of this, no warrior of this stature.
Yeah.
So, but it's a Swedish stone, or it's in Sweden, and
exactly. I mean, I think this is actually another reason why it made a good fit for my book, because it is an object from outside of the West Norse cultural area, which we usually associate strongly with Skaldic poetry, right? We usually think of the Skaldic tradition as centered in Norway and Iceland,
yes,
and possibly extending into Denmark, but less likely into what we now think of as Sweden. I think the explanation that I find most persuasive for why this stone is there on the island of Öland is that this is the leader of a traveling Viking warband, and the stone is erected in the harbour of the warriors, as Karlevi would mean, or the sanctuary of the warriors, by his retinue. So we have as well this link to the collective utterance of the retinue, even though it is the single-voiced Skaldic stanza, nonetheless, what lies behind it is this collective wish for commemoration on the part of the leader's retinue. And this is, I think, another important strand in my argument.
Yes. Okay. Yeah. Commemoration is also the topic of the first large section of the book, which the book is divided into 3 sections. And in each of these sections, you explore the interference between Skaldic poetry and, in the first chapter or first section, landscapes and commemoration. And then you then poetry and the visual arts in part 2, and poetry and sound and music in part 3. And so the main text that you discuss in the first long section is Ynglingatal. And I wonder if you can give us a brief introduction to this fascinating poem, and also present your main thoughts on the poem that you lay out in the chapter.
Yeah, thank you. Ynglingatal is a long poem commemorating the deaths of some 27 or so prehistoric rulers of Svithjof, the central part of Sweden, the realm of the Sphere, and Viken, the Oslo fjord as it is today, ruled over by Dano-Norwegian rulers of, I think, at this period, somewhat uncertain identity. Whether we should describe them as Danish or Norwegian kings is a little unclear. And it's a famous and strange poem because it describes these very unheroic deaths of these rulers. It doesn't tell you anything much about their great deeds, but rather commemorates the somewhat bizarre ways in which they meet their ends. They're knocked off their ship into the sea, or they are transfixed by a pitchfork while going out to take revenge for a sparrow, or such like strange events. Many of them are burned in their halls. And this is presented in the new edition of the Skaldic corpus as the oldest Skaldic poem that we have. And I think this identification is probably pretty true. It seems to date from the early years of the 10th century. And so it has a kind of foundational quality for the corpus as a whole, which is partly why I was interested in writing about it. But interpretations of it to date have, I think, not really fully taken into account this foundational quality of this poem, because a popular interpretation is to suggest that it's somehow parodic or satirical, that these bizarre deaths are meant to be somewhat ridiculous, and that the audience is meant to laugh, in particular at the kings of Svithjoth, and to find them rather kind of risible. And I think the proposal that the earliest work we have in this genre is a parody is a rather strange one. I mean, I don't know how we would be able to tell. you need surely an example of the real thing before you can figure out that something is a parody of it. So I argue against this interpretation and in favor of the idea that while I think we can't say too much about why the kings suffer these bizarre deaths, the bizarre deaths do form a kind of memorial kernel, and the poet presents himself as collecting the memories of these rulers, which are often associated with significant sites in the landscape, and he often tells us about those sites in the landscape, things like large monoliths or ruins halls, and remediating them, making a claim to be able to stitch these stories together in a sequence and attach the name of his patron at the end of it. And I see this kind of claim of mediation as being what makes this a foundational skaldic text. The idea that the skald in the section of the poem devoted to Svithjoth knows these old stories, and interestingly in the section of the poem dedicated to Viken, to southeastern Norway, he has seen these places, he has been to these places, and he knows about the kings who are buried there. And so I think I draw a parallel between this this poem and the Ruk runestone, which I think performs a somewhat similar act of personalizing communal memory and attaching it to the name of a particular person. And I think that the combination of this medial claim and what seems to be a new medial form of stanzaic poetry makes for a very powerful memorial technology. And I think that this is really what Ynglingatal is doing. It is making a claim to fix memory in a new medium that will make it last, make it permanent. Yeah.
So we have the poem Ynglingatal, and we have the Rukstone, the runestone, not the one we looked at before, but another one.
Different one.
And both of them are new media at this point in time, you believe?
Yeah. I mean, I know that there are, of course, earlier runic inscriptions, but Ruk is very, very unusual. It's very much larger, and it has a much longer inscription, and it seems to have a kind of self-consciousness about the earlier runic tradition, which it sets itself in some ways apart from. Yeah. And of course, one is a hostage to fortune, arguing that an oral poetic form is new. Once again, how do we know? But I think the Ruk runestone, there is a stanza on the stone which one can see as transitional between Fornitherslag, the old traditional common Germanic alliterative form of poetry, which has very, very deep roots, and this new stanzaic skaldic form. So that's the sort of what licenses my claim that Kviduhautur in its fully elaborated form in Ynglingatal is new.
So did the Rukstone give rise to a tradition in the same way as Ynglingatal gave rise to a tradition of memorial poetry?
Yeah, I think the Rukstone gives rise to a runestone tradition in Sweden that is focused on the raiser, where the person who caused the stone to be raised is focalized in the inscription, is placed at the beginning. And so the stone is not a sort of anonymous utterance like we might think of earlier Swedish inscriptions, for instance, that often consist of just a single word or a couple of words and perhaps an image. But we have a claim to personalize memory and to attach it to the name of a particular individual by focalizing the razor and the person commemorated, which is what the very beginning of the rook inscription does, of course.
Okay, yeah, thanks. You mentioned that a dominant interpretation of the Ynglingatal poem has been that it's a parody of sorts. Another common interpretation that you discuss in the book is the idea that it is a genealogical poem. Can I ask you to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, thank you for asking about this, because this is one of the chapters of the book that I think is fairly complex and a little perhaps a little more inaccessible. So it's nice to have a chance to try and open out what I mean by it.
Yes.
I'm by no means the first person to think that Ynglingatal is not a very convincing instance of a genealogical poem. This is a point that has been made before. We have neither the point of origin of the genealogy nor a terribly strong invocation of kinship links between the kings and the list. We really only have a list. And I think that what's going on here is that the way that Ynglingatal is taken up into the saga tradition, into the history writing tradition as we see it in the 13th century, for instance, is playing a large part in this interpretation of the poem as genealogical, because the saga writing tradition is very much concerned to interpret the poem in this way. But I think we also see in a poem composed only about 80 years later than Ynglingatal, Hálagatal, that skald Eyvindur Skaldaspillir is really reacting to Ynglingatal, going one further and making the claim that Ynglingatal in its extant form doesn't make, which is that of actual descent from the gods for the people he is praising. So in Hálagatal, the Earls of Hladir are said to be literally descended from Odin, whereas this isn't actually a claim that Ynglingatal makes. And so I argue in that chapter that this interest in genealogy is everywhere in medieval history writing, and already apparent in Noric's Konungatal, a poem from about 1190. But I don't think we are justified in retrojecting it all the way back into Ynglingatal.
Interesting, yeah. So the claim of descent from the god, as you say, it's found in this poem that's a bit later, Hálagatal. It's not found in Ynglingatal itself, but it is found in the saga that transmits Ynglingatal to us. So the text that frames Ynglingatal for us. So how do we disentangle these two, the saga and the poem?
Yeah. I mean, I think this is really difficult. I think, of course, one could easily argue, and many have, that it's simply the case that we don't have all of the stanzas of Ynglingatal. And so the fact that Heimskringla suggests that the beginning of the genealogy is indeed with the gods is just because these stanzas are missing from Ynglingatal, and that we would be justified in assuming that they were once there. And I think my sense is that genealogy is not a kind of natural and automatic and kind of everyday phenomenon. It's a literary construct, right? It's a historical or literary construct, a thing that people make to explain a sense of the progression of events over time. And so I think the fact that we don't see much interest in genealogy anywhere else in the early poetic tradition or in the runic tradition suggests that perhaps this particular construct is one that arrives in the North along with the book, along with Christian interests in genealogy, which are enormously pronounced, right? This is a really important structure for Christian thinking about the origins of the world.
Yeah, but if we look at sagas, for instance, the sagas of Icelanders, we see these large, elaborate genealogies that are introduced every time a character is introduced. And also, I guess, runestones deal to a certain extent with genealogy, but maybe not deep genealogy in the sense of Ynglingatal.
Shallow genealogy, indeed. Yeah, all you find in skaldic verse and in runic inscriptions is about 3 generations, the immediate kin group, really.
Okay.
Not to say that people didn't have ideas about their ancestors, of course they did, but I don't think those ideas necessarily took the form of genealogy in this pre-literate tradition.
Interesting. Yeah, it's this idea of genealogy seems very embedded in our culture, and also the way we think about the Middle Ages.
For sure.
Yeah.
For sure. But I think this doesn't necessarily have to have ancient Germanic roots to be something that is very important in medieval thinking, right?
No, that's right. Absolutely. Okay. So you also make in this section, you also make an interesting claim that Uppsala is remembered as a ruin. What do you mean by that? And sort of what is the status of Uppsala at the time when the poem is composed? And Uppsala is where the Swedish kings sort of had their power base.
That's right. So this is where the famous mounds are at Gamla Uppsala. It was a place that somewhat earlier than the time that Ynglingatal was composed was a very important site with great monumentalization, large halls, active craft production, long ceremonial kind of pathways, all manner of really fancy buildings. And again, in about the 12th century becomes an important site once more. The church is built and a large cathedral-like church is built. But at the time when Ynglingatal is composed, there isn't really a great deal there. And archaeologists have suggested that what happens is that this earlier set of monuments, in particular the large hall at Uppsala, get burned and get, in fact, in a way, commemorated on the ground. That the trace of the outline of the burned hall gets covered with a layer of clay, and some generation or so later, animal bones are deposited along the lines of this burnt hall. So my idea there is that on the ground in Uppsala, the past takes the form of a scar or a mark rather than a glorious kind of relic or something continuous. It's something that has gone and disappeared. And I feel like this matches up pretty nicely with the representation of the disastrous ends of the Swedish kings in Ynglingatal, the sense of the past as one of disaster, ruin, and memory, rather than one of contemporary glory that will found kingship in the present.
So is it a tragic poem? That this part of the poem is it tragic rather than parodic?
Yeah. I think I would be inclined to see it more as tragic. Yeah, I mean, I think the kings, and I think describing the king's deaths as risible is a little limited. I mean, some of the kings fall in combat against the Svea's enemies, for instance. These deaths are not for nothing, even if they're also not described in heroic terms. But I think this is a kind of category mistake. We have other genres of poetry that are concerned with heroic memorialization. This is not the kind of thing that Kviðuhaltur poetry really does.
Yeah, you make an interesting point along the way that most of the skaldic poems that we have is about how the king, whoever it is, deals death to his enemies and leaves this trail of dead bodies in his wake, while it's the opposite that happens in Ynglingatal. Can I ask you to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. I mean, I think this is very true, that the kings are victims, essentially, in Ynglingatal. They are the ones to whom bad things happen. and I think it's a kind of generic, I would see it as like a generic division of labor, where we have a large body of heroic poetry in skaldic and Eddic meters, which is concerned with this representation of the king as the successful death dealer. But it is concerned with the praiseworthy acts worthy of being memorialized, which normally take place in the very recent past, in the case of the skaldic corpus.
Oh.
They are, it's a kind of current events type of poetry. And Ynglingatal is expressly not about current events. It's about the very distant past. And it seems to view this past as a place of kind of tragic death for the kings, which I think is the big mystery about this poem, that I don't explain this really or answer this question because I don't know the answer. But you can certainly see parallels, for instance, in the early medieval saints legends. This is the way that the royal martyrs of the Anglo-Saxon tradition are described, for instance. So it does seem to be a tendency in early medieval royal legends to describe the kings in this way. But I can't explain why. I don't know.
Interesting, but it's brought up to the contemporary time of the poet, and it ends with this beautiful image of serenity, I think, that you lay out in the book.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. So Rögnvalder somehow is the inheritor of all of this, but he seems to be, we leave him in this kind of enthroned under the canopy of the heavens. This, as you say, very beautiful image of serenity. So in the book, I make this perhaps rather daring suggestion that perhaps there is some connection here with Carolingian practices of royal memorialization, that maybe, while I don't think it's at all likely that the skalds spoke Latin, that maybe they had been to a place like Aachen or Ingelheim and seen Carolingian royal commemoration in the form of something like the Palatine Chapel at Aachen, or perhaps had held a book in their hands where they saw these images of the enthroned king under this Empyrean canopy, and thought that something similar would be fitting for Rögnvalder. But it is a strange disjunction between this vision of him and what has happened to all of the previous kings. It makes you wonder sort of what lies in wait for Rögnvalder.
Yeah, exactly. What end will come to him? And we don't know, do we?
We don't. No.
The
poem is fragmentary.
Yeah, we don't know anything about him, basically.
No. He's a completely obscure figure.
Yeah. Interesting. Okay, you mentioned this Carolingian connection, and you return to that in the second large section of the book, which deals with the Old Norse picture poems, and ostensibly describe imagery on shields and other objects. So can I ask you to just introduce this group of texts briefly and present your arguments regarding these poems?
Sure. So in the second section of the book, I talk about what are traditionally known either as picture describing poems or as skaldic ekphrases. These are a group of poems that recount mythological narratives with the conceit that they are describing images on a hall or on a shield, a hall in one case and a shield in two other cases. And in the refrain, the sort of repeated chorus-like stanza of these poems, we hear about this material object that is supposed to be the bearer of the images that the poet is constructing a verbal equivalent to. And in this part of the book, I question this idea of equivalence, this idea that what the poets are setting out to do is to construct a verbal equivalent to a piece of visual art with the aim of praising the object and so indirectly praising the patron, which has been how these have been interpreted in the past. And I suggest instead that we should think a little harder about what the rhetorical force of the claim to describe a visual object might have been. And I also suggest that we should stop thinking nearly so hard about what these pictures might have looked like, because we don't have any decorated shields and we don't have any halls with pagan carvings. So the sort of reconstructive efforts that have been directed towards these things, I think, are somewhat misguided. And I think instead we should think about what verbal description enables, the medial affordances of verbal description in contrast to visual art. And I think this is what the poets really play on.
And so what are these medial affordances?
Well, I think one of them is that while the visual object is singular, the verbal interpretations are plural. So we often get a setting of competition implied in the framing of these poems, where we might have two poets, or perhaps even more, who make different interpretations of some kind of visual stimulus. So I think that's one thing. And I think another is that of energeia, that of a kind of emotionally intensified description, which is in the visual images from the Viking Age that we have, which are not terribly many. We don't see too many signs of intense emotion. There's no equivalent to Laocoon or something like that. But in the poetry, we often do get representation of quite extreme emotion. So I think the poets are also capitalizing on the ability of their verbal works of art to excite the audience's emotions and make their interpretation of the visual source more persuasive. And so the sort of scene of use that I conjure up for these picture poems is one of competitive interpretation of a somewhat probably ambiguous visual prompt, which I don't think probably was, like a large painting with all of the episodes of, you know, the funeral of Baldur on it or anything like that, but probably something much more singular and enigmatic. The poets interpreted in various ways and attempted to persuade the audience of the rightness of their interpretation, and that this was a kind of what they call in Old Norse an íþrótt, a challenge to the skill of the poet.
Interesting, and you present a suggestion as to what these visual stimulus might be. Can I ask you to talk a bit more about that?
Yeah, these are these really fascinating images that have been studied by, for instance, Michael Nyssen, an archaeologist working in Uppsala, on very small, not on shields. We don't have any images from shields, but on small pieces of jewelry, on brooches that seem to represent human and animal body parts that, as you rotate or change the angle of view of these objects, rearrange into different configurations. So you have, he calls them puzzle pictures, vexierbilder. So these images that you can haptically manipulate and come up with a different sense of what this is a picture of. And I see this as a kind of rather compelling analog to what I'm suggesting for the picture poems, this idea of the ambiguity of the single image being something that can give rise to multiple interpretations.
That's really interesting. But then the poems live on without the object, so to speak.
Yeah.
How do they do that? What kind of function do they serve later on?
I think we can say two things here. We can certainly say that the saga tradition is very fascinated by the idea of competition. So they love stories of poets competing with one another and arguing with one another in verse. And so these types of anecdotes would have then, these types of interests would have facilitated the survival of these poems. And I think too, in the setting of the prosetta, which is where they are transmitted, they function as a kind of text before text in a way, as a kind of the imaginary shields a source that can take the audience of the prosetta, this book composed in the early 13th century, telling us about the ancient poetry, that can sort of enable the audience to look back into the very distant past and to form some impressions of how people thought, for instance, about the gods in the pre-Christian period. So I don't know. I mean, I think they're preserved in the prosetta, of course, partly because they are great monuments of poetry. They're very beautiful and very interesting poems. But I think they also have this kind of almost epistemological function where the prosetta is concerned with this question of how can we know about our own past. This is one of its driving concerns. And these shield poems are one of the answers. This idea that we have these poems that will tell us something about authentic pagan belief back in the old days, and that are attached to these objects that we know existed, even though they are now vanished.
Oh. So you mentioned that although this is a we have a definite group of texts, and we often refer to them as picture poems or ekphrases, but we don't have this term found, or we don't find this term in Old Norse grammatical treatises that otherwise discuss figures of speech and tropoi in some detail. Why do you think they did not discuss this?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's a good question. It doesn't seem to have been a subgenre or an ability of the poets that attracted the attention of the commentators. For whatever reason. I'm not sure that I really have a very good answer to that. It just doesn't seem to be something that caught their eye.
Okay.
Perhaps you have an idea, Jonas.
Well, I sort of no, I don't have an idea, but I have something to say about this, because one of the stanzas from the oldest shield poem is quoted in a grammatical treatise, but not as an example of an ekphrasis, but as an example of a digression under the term ebasis, meaning sort of a walking away or something like that. And of course, we don't know if this author or this grammarian, rhetorician from the mid 14th century knew much more about the original poems than we do today. But it's still interesting to imagine that he sees these descriptions as actually digressions from what's really going on in the poem, and what might that be? Yes.
Right. If you could just get rid of all of that stuff about shields, then you might have quite a good poem.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, so there are some questions from the audience, and the first one is from Mark Sandberg. I'll read it out to you.
Okay.
Are there taken for granted assumptions or limits within modern media theory that become more conspicuous through the inclusion in discussion of these older materials and examples?
This is a very good question. I think I'm not entirely sure that I can answer this question to your satisfaction, Mark, but I think that the special sort of media feature of the Old Norse material is this situation somewhere between an embodied oral mediation and a textual one. And I think that this is, I don't know if this is something that forms a limit in modern media studies, but I think it has tended to be a very important demarcation line in studies of Old Norse texts, that we're accustomed to drawing this very strict dichotomy between the oral and the literate. And I think that the skaldic tradition enables us to complicate this quite a lot by thinking not only of interactions between oral, sonorous, sound-based phenomena, which are in the third part of the book that we haven't really talked about very much yet, and textual phenomena, but also introduce other media such as inscription, for instance, the Karlevi example. And I think that the sort of really specific medial quality of the medieval Icelandic transmission is this really, really long period of handwritten manuscript transmission. And this is something that I think there are not too many parallels for that I know of, that this poetry continued to be copied out and written down in manuscripts right up until the early 19th century. And that this kind of long period of manuscript transmission coexists, though, with a continued oral performance, because these texts were written down because they were used in a practice of evening entertainment, as it's called, kveldvaka, where people read these sagas out and read out their included verses. And so I guess I feel like the continued involvement of an embodied bodily aspect, even after the arrival not only of the codex but also of print, is something that is quite specific and quite particular to the Icelandic situation, but which might potentially have some interesting resonances as we move into our own social media era, right, where all of the kind of traditional media institutions seem to be breaking down, and we seem to have a much more distributed, individualized, fragmented media landscape, which is all about the activities of individual persons. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I hope it gestures towards it. Thank you for the question.
There is another question as well. It's not said who wrote it, but I'll just read it out to you. The medium through which works of art continue to influence later ages is always different from the one in which they affect their own age. So it's a quote from Walter Benjamin. Then it says, transformation change is essential to the media concept for Benjamin. Could you say more about the relation between memory and media? Could you talk a bit about the theoretical basis of your claim to a connection between media and memory?
Okay, this is another very good question. Yeah, I think the first part of it, the Benjamin quote that the medium in which works affect a subsequent age is not the one of their origin, is a really fantastic and wonderful encapsulation of the situation of skaldic poetry, which is something that I come to at the very, very end of my book, namely that while we strain our ears to hear the skaldic performers of the Viking Age, this poetry is, of course, all transmitted to us in manuscript, and the scholarly tradition of engagement with this poetry has tended to be rather cavalier in its treatment of the manuscript tradition. So I think there's a sense in which we have this memory in the poetry itself, which I talked about in the context of Ynglingatal, right, where the skald seems to look back on a pre-existing memorial tradition, but we also have a memory of these texts that continues, that moves forward in time if we place ourselves in the Middle Ages, that moves forward in time in the manuscript transmission up until almost the present day, in which, if we would allow it to, could expand our sense of what the skaldic poetic is about. It could allow our sense of kind of correct construction of poetic metaphors and things like that, which are great obsessions of the scholarship on skaldic poetry. It could allow that to be expanded with an awareness of slightly divergent practices in the manuscript tradition, which maybe look back on the great tradition of skaldic verse, the Höfuðskald, the big skalds, but also engage with new practices of poetry, foremost among them the rimur, a tradition of sung poetry, which becomes really important in the late Middle Ages and really takes over from Drottningkvæði as the main poetic form practiced in Iceland in the early modern period. And I think this kind of rapprochement between skaldic poetry and music is a super interesting one, because the skalds themselves present music as poetry's other. They talk about music as the thing that their poetry is most definitely not. But in the rimur, which take a lot from skaldic poetry, we see a real move towards the condition of music. And I think this sort of resounding quality is something that I would like to look into in my next explorations of this topic.
Oh, that sounds really interesting. I look forward to see that. So you mentioned the manuscript transmission here a few times at the end, and we are also approaching the end. But I just have a final quick question.
Yeah.
The text and the texts and the poetry that you have been studying are all available in good recent editions. But you have also spent some time studying the texts in their manuscript context and in the manuscripts, the medieval manuscripts. And why has this been important to you?
Yeah, I think it's a bit perverse, like many things about my project, because we do now finally have an edition that makes this poetry accessible, right? It's not translated into Danish anymore. No shade to Danish, but it's not really these days an international scholarly language. We finally have an edition that has English translations and makes this material accessible to those outside the field, and also makes manuscript variation much more accessible by normalizing the variants. You can kind of read the variants back into the text much more easily. So I think this is a true modern edition that really does surpass Finney Jonsson's very fine efforts. But I think if we allow those edited texts to really drive our approach to these pre-modern materials, then we can find ourselves in a situation where we treat these poems as if they are the authored products of the modern era, where we find small echoes of phrasing or something like that, and we place great weight upon them, and we forget this enormous variation and also the immense loss of manuscript material that needs to always be in the background of our thinking. So I think by returning to the manuscripts, we are reminded of this medial fact about the skaldic tradition, which we too readily forget if we focus on the modern edition.
Okay, thank you. I agree. I guess time is about to be up. So I will just conclude by repeating the words of the reviewer that I mentioned initially, that this is a wonderful book, and we can even say tolle læge, pick it up and read it. Yes, then I would like to thank everyone for being in attendance and listening to this conversation. And thank you to Kate as well, and to the Townsend Center for setting this up.
Many thanks, Jonas, for the wonderful questions. I've greatly enjoyed the discussion.
Thank you.